and welcome back to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today. For our free wire tutorial here on YouTube today, I want to share a bead soup design with you. Now this is something that you can use where you have odds and ends of beads, or just do what I did, which is put my hand into the bead soup or the bead jar and pick out a random collection. Now I do like a bit of symmetry, so I'm probably only going to work with beads that I have at least two of, but you only need two that are the same if you want that symmetry. Let's head down to the board and look at an example of the design we're going to make together today. So this is an example of the design made as a complete necklace. For this I've created a very simple J-hook fastening at the back, but you can also create this as a bar necklace, which could only be this long and then connected with chain and traditional clasps to go around the back. The design technique is basically the same. What we're going to do is layer up, and let me just grab some beads which I literally drew at random from my big pot of beads. So I do have an individual central bead, and I know that in this I've got several beads which are indeed the same. So I can make pairs, I can make a symmetrical trail on some wire. For me, the only proviso would be that these large beads have got at least a 1mm aperture, as I'm going to be working with 1mm or 18 gauge wire at the core of my design. Other than that, really anything goes. So I can see some pairs here already in terms of colour, size, shape and design. What I'm going to do is cut myself a great big long length of some copper colour wire. I would probably start to begin with, in case I decide I want to make a big full necklace, I'm going to unspool about 24 inches of wire. That gives me the opportunity to chop and change my mind as I go through. So to begin with, I have a 24 inch or 60 centimetre length of 1mm or 18 gauge wire. What I'm going to do now is just pick out some pairs of beads which match and which will fit on the wire I have chosen. So I'm not going to bore you whilst you watch me try and get these on to the wire, but what I will do is build a little symmetrical section of beads featuring a random selection from my stash. So onto my 1mm or 18 gauge wire, I have threaded an assortment of beads. They are symmetrical and there's a large centerpiece. You don't have to follow any protocol with a bead soup necklace. You can really go completely your own way and enjoy the process. If you'd like to join me down at the board, I will show you what I've done so far and how we're going to move on now. So onto my wire, I have loaded my selection of beads and I've got lots of space left at either end. There are actually more than enough beads on here to complete a full necklace project. Now you might notice at one end I've turned a simple loop, and that's simply to stop the beads rolling off. What I tend to do is give that wire a really good warm. And then if we do need to use that last little bit, it's still going to be plenty pliable to do that. So I've just used my round nose pliers to very simply turn a small loop on the end, and that is just to stop those beads from getting away from me, because having had that happen before, I don't want it to happen again. What we're going to do is take a quick look at the beads that I'm using today. Now these are all from my friends at Jessie James Beads, from various packs that I've used for other projects. These are the ones that didn't go into the finished piece for whatever reason. So this is a beautiful clay bead, it's a golem bead, and then there's all sorts of a mix of crystals and metallics. I have included some spacers, and I've also included bead caps at either end, and that's because however I choose to finish that, whether it be into chain as a bar necklace or as my example a complete necklace, whichever way I want to do that, I do like to protect those last few beads from the metal that we have to do at the very ends. So it's always worth ending with a very strong bead just to ensure its safety. What I want to do next is make sure that my central bead is dead center in that long strand of wire, and we're just going to open the other beads away for now. If you prefer, you can scooch them all the way onto either end if that helps you to find your exact center point, or you could always use a tape measure. There's always the proper way of doing things if you want to. For the first layer of wire I'm going to add onto that main necklace, I'm going to use some 0.8mm or 20 gauge wire. Now I have approximately a 2 foot length here, that's 24 inches, 60 centimetres, and the wire I'm working in is an antique bronze colourway, 20 gauge 0.8. It's easier to show you with a slightly different colourway on the board, just to show you how things layer up. Now the reason that we layer up this necklace is interest, really. If I just show you that finished piece again very quickly, you've got lots of swooshes and swells that you can be really exciting with. I'm going to show you some extra techniques as well on that in a minute. But the other reason is that we strengthen the design, so hopefully it will last for a very, very long time to come. You can use 1mm 18 gauge wire to create a necklace, but it's quite floopy. We don't want a floopy necklace, we want it to be a little bit stronger. So I've got my 2 foot length of that 0.8 20 gauge, and I'm going to find the centre of this piece of wire and give it a really good smooth through. 2 or 3 strokes should be enough to get that fluid. And I'm just going to bodge the wire around until I get a nice arc shape. The other way that you can do this is to use a form such as a mandrel, or you can simply eyeball it, which is what I'm going to do. So I'm just going to create an arc shape over the top of that central bead. I will centralise this in the board in just a second. Just need to cross that over at the top. There we go. So making sure that my focal bead or my central bead is in the middle. I'm going to pop that arc of wire over the top and pinch that firmly into position. You do need to be happy with that arc shape. I'm then going to withdraw the bead out of the way to protect it, pinch that into position, and then take the long tail on the right hand side, which is just under half the length of the wire, and push that around our main strand of wire. I'm going to do that twice and then bring the wire down again. So if we look at this on the board now, you've got an arc shape which will be around the bead in just a moment. I've travelled over the top of that central core wire. I've gone all the way around once and then a second time. Before I go anywhere, I want to make sure that that is nice and neat and tidy. So I'm just going to very, very cautiously tighten that up slightly by just pressing very, very gently with the tips of those pliers. You can just push the whole thing down and draw those coils together if you wish to. We're then going to bring that bead back into position. Now at this stage, because I'm right dominant, I'm going to need to flip the design around. So I'm going to pop that upside down. What this enables me to do is again check that everything is centralised, make sure I'm happy with the bead position. I can then recheck that circling form, that arcing form, make sure that I don't take it too tight over the surface of the bead. Now I'm not quite happy with this wrapping just here, so I am going to tighten that up gently. And there we go. Pop your bead into the central position, take the long tail of wire on this side, and then pinch the wire over the top of the core. You can protect that bead if you need to with your thumb or with a tool. I'm going to use my thumb, and then just draw the tail of the wire around and try to get a nice, neat, tidy wrap so that the tail of wire goes in the same direction as the other tail. I am looking for symmetry with a design like this. So you can see my arc is not quite perfect, so I'm just going to use the flat surfaces of my pliers to straighten that out and then push that back into shape until I'm happy with it. There's still a little bit of movement available on those beads. So I'm quite happy that there's a little bit of a gap over the top of my bead there. I can spin that around. I have the option to add more to that later. So what I'm going to do is every time I do something on one side, I'm going to repeat it in a mirror image on the other side. So let's bring our first bead in. This is quite a small, smoky opal colour. Now my finer gauge wire, the 0.8 or 20, is coming over the surface of that core. So I want it to be nice and warm to begin with, and then I'm going to bring the tail all the way around underneath the core wire, but circling around my bead on the strand. And then I'm going to go again twice around that core. Now every time I do this, the next section of wire is going to get a little bit firmer to work with. So I am again going to flip the design back to its original orientation. and I'm going to slide the opposite and equal bead into position. Now the reason I always move one bead at a time is that it's really easy to not make it symmetrical. So again, that 0.8, which is represented here by the bronze colour, is coming over the surface of the core wire. What I want it to do is circle across the next bead in line. So I'll pinch the bead into position and I'll take the tail of wire underneath that core and draw it all the way around, wrapping it neatly and firmly twice around that core wire. Again, these two sections of wire will become taut as you work through the design. So I'm quite happy with there being movement in my central bead. If you wanted that to be tightened up, you could simply pinch things together at this stage. I actually prefer it to be a little bit more relaxed and open. So I'm going to bring the next bead in. I'm here, so I might as well start on this side. The bronze, which is the 0.8, has come over the top of that wire. I'm going to take it all the way around the bead and underneath the core wire, drawing the tail around once and then twice. So for this first part of the design, I'm always going to be coming from the top of the core wire, around the underside of the bead, to underneath the core wire and wrapping twice. So if I stick to that all the way around, even though I've only used 2 feet of the lighter wire, I should get a reasonable way around the necklace. As I mentioned earlier, you will, if you possibly can, want to use a slightly longer length of wire. However, it's perfectly permissible to use shorter sections and then wrap them in a slightly different way. So I'm going to go for another couple of movements on this side. I've done one bead on the left hand side, so I want to do one on the right hand side. Obviously when I flip it around, everything is the right hand side because that makes my life so much easier. So again, little tiny bit of warmth in that first section of wire. Push the bead into position, protect the bead, take the core wire from the top, I beg your pardon, take the lighter wire from the top of the core around the underside of the bead to underneath the core wire, pushing up against that bead once and twice. And then we can bring those next beads into position. Now, one of the beauties of not finishing the necklace completely, if you get to here and you realise you've mis-stranded and you've got odd beads, if you don't want odd beads, you still have the opportunity to de-strand all of those beads off the wire and start again. As it happens, I have the opportunity to continue in exactly the same way for quite a long time. So it's really essential, if you're looking for symmetry, that you think carefully before you make a wrap. Finer gauge wire from the top of the core around the underside of the bead to the underside of the core, and then I'm going to wrap twice. Now you can wrap just one time if you want to preserve your wire length. However, one of the reasons I like to wrap twice on this first level is that it gives me an opportunity to add a second layer of wire later, and I will show you that in a short while. What I'm going to do for now is continue along and single wrap as many beads as I can with my available wire, and I'll join you back here in just a moment. So I've continued with that second layer of 0.8 or 20 gauge wire in the bronze colour until I ran out, basically. So I'll show you just quickly what we've got so far. I'll show you this on the board in just a second, but what I wanted to show you is, even though we were working with a 2-foot section of wire, we've still managed to completely add another layer to that central section. So if I drop this down to the board, we'll have a closer look together and then we'll move on to the next layer. So with that extra layer of wire, we've added detail and strength to this central section. When I got to the end, all I did was wrap twice around that core wire as normal, and then just trim away and push that wire as flat as possible. So with these other beads at the back end, I've got a couple of choices. I can add an extra section of wire to encompass these later, or when I come to decide what I'm doing next, I can simply remove them or leave them as just beads without any extra wires. So this is the reason I choose to use quite a long piece of wire at the top. It just means that you've got lots of choices until later. Another thing that you might notice is that it's not particularly shaped just yet. It doesn't need to take on its final form just yet. We're going to get there. What I'm going to do then is take another 2-foot length of that 0.8mm or 20 gauge wire. Let's just pop that over the top and trim that from the reel. if you can work with longer lengths, you'll be able to get more beads in. Well, what we're going to do now is add another layer. Now, on our first pass with the lighter wire, we chose to go from underneath all the way around the base of the bead, over the top, and wrap twice. What you can do, instead of wrapping twice, is wrap 1.5 times. I'm going to show you that for my next detail, and we're going to start by warming the centre section of our wire. What I'm going to do to begin with is start with a little arc shape in exactly the same place that we began, but underneath rather than over. I just want to match that arc if I possibly can. That looks reasonably similar, so I'm going to flip that wire over now. I might just shape that slightly differently. Depends what catches your eye. So I'm going to create a little bit of a naked, almost a halo for that central focal bead. We're going to start in much the same way by gripping the wire into position on one side. And what I'm going to do is wrap the wire around the core again. So my finer gauge wire, in this case represented by the bronze 0.8 or 20 gauge, I'm wrapping that over the top of the very first place where we wrapped, and I'm taking it 1.5 times around. So instead of going all the way around for a second time, bringing me to underneath the bead, I'm going to start over the top of the bead. Now, before I continue wrapping and creating a halo for each of these beads, I'm going to match and lock in that central shape. So bringing it to the upside down so it's easier for me, making sure that I'm happy with that little arc shape. You might need to play with it. Because it's 0.8, it's much more flexible for us to work around the core, but it will lose its shape just slightly quicker. So I want to take a second just to make sure that I'm happy with how that's sitting. Let's just get this one out of the way for a sec. Let's push him over here. Otherwise he's going to be in the camera all the time. So I want to match what I did on the first side, but in a mirror image. So if I pinch this into position, bring the tail all the way around, 1.5 times around that core, so that it comes up in the same direction as its mirror twin. So I'm just going to move that over slightly so that it matches more accurately. And I think that's a reasonable halo effect, or a little bit of a frame effect to begin with. What I'm going to do now is decide where I want my next piece of wire to go. So because my finer gauge, the bronze on the second layer now, so we've got the core wire, this is our first layer, this is our second layer. It's coming over the top of the whole assembly. So I'm going to warm that through and bring the tail of wire underneath the frame, around this side of the bead. And I'm using my non-dominant forefinger to stop the wire from going underneath the bead. I want it to still be visible from the front. So we're going to go once and then twice around. Now the reason we go twice around on this turn, but only 1.5 times on the first turn, is to make sure that we're going to get the same kind of effect, a little bit of a halo against every bead. If you want to have 2 passes of wire underneath the bead rather than either side, you can absolutely do that. You're golden, you can do whatever you fancy. So smoothing the wire until it's warm, drawing it underneath the bead, underneath the core wire, 1 and then 2, and then I'm just going to continue and show you how quickly this can occur. So we need to get that done round a second time, push it over the top of this funny shaped bead. Now I quite like to have a bit touching the front of the bead, but if you want, you can get it to replicate the design of the bead itself if you're working with angular beads. So I'm just going to support that, push the tail of wire underneath, make sure that that hits where I want it to on the bead. You could fiddle with that if you wanted to make it sit exactly where you'd like, and then once around the core, twice around the core. Round beads are so easy to work with, you might prefer to only work with round beads. Now my wire is running short. You can see I've got a little bit of a tail. I might be able to get to the far side of this gargantuan bead, but I don't know how much wire I'm going to use on the other side. So what I will do is take that over for a second time and just sit that alone for a moment. We may end up cutting the wire here. What we need to do now is replicate what we did on the first side on the second side. So it can be super fast. A little bit noisy, but super fast. So when we get to the third layer of wire, we will probably only want to turn one time around the core. We might want to change things up and do something different. So again, I'm going to follow the shape of this funny angled bead, slightly octagon shape. Just got poked in the elbow by another piece of wire on my desk. This is the risk of working with wire. So pinching that wire into position, once around the core, twice around the core, around that bead once and twice, around the bead once. Now this is where we got to on the other bead side. So you can see I've got a tail of wire available on both of those. If I designate that this is my front surface, what we're going to do is try and hide the ends away underneath. Now because we're next to a giant bead, we don't really need to worry about cutting the wire on the back because it shouldn't ever hit the skin. So we're on the back of the design now, and I'm going to cut only the correct piece of wire as close to that bead as I possibly can, trim the end away, and then bearing in mind the bead that you're working with, I'm going to protect my bead with my thumbnail, and then I'm going to tuck that tail away inside the weaving. Same on this side. Tuck that away inside. Now you would want to protect your bead normally, but I just want to show you the type of design that we're working with. Just get that tail tucked away until it's not going to catch on anything that it shouldn't. Now you can see that we are starting to build greater strength, but we do still have flexibility to shape the design as we desire. I love working with projects like this because you can use really any beads from your stash. If you're going for symmetry, you will need at least 2 of each, and they will need to have a 1mm drill aperture at least if you're going to use them on a core wire. So you can see already we're making something that's a little bit stronger, a little bit more interesting. I'm going to show you now a third layer, again using 0.8mm or 20 gauge wire to add more detail and extra strength. For the last layer, I have got about 3 feet, so 36 inches left, about 90 centimetres of my 0.8mm or 20 gauge wire. And I've added some smaller beads from that little stash that I showed you at the beginning. A little bit of a random draw from a bead pot full of unused bead sections. And I found the smallest beads I could. Now I've added an odd number of these little bronze tone daisy spaces into the centre because it means that there will be a middle bit and I can create a slightly more symmetrical piece. Now those have been threaded onto the centre of my 3 foot length of that 0.8 or 20 gauge wire. So what we're going to do is just pull the design up to the centre of the board. Find the very middle of our last section of wire. Now it's just our last section. You can build as many layers as you want. I've made some of these pieces with probably 7 or 8 layers of wire. They become quite a thing to wear in the end. So what I want to do now is decide whether I want this to go over the top of my bead or skirting down underneath. Now it doesn't have to go outside your last layer. It can go on top of it. It can go wherever you want it to go. You're completely the master of your destiny. On this length of wire, because teeny beads are annoying to pick up, I've just put some small loops on the end. So if one goes awry, it doesn't really matter. So I decide where this is going to fit, and I think it will look quite nice just over the surface of the bottom of that bead. And that works nicely with the number of beads I've layered on, or threaded on rather. So you would probably prefer to have quite small beads going up towards the ends here, just because it sits more pleasantly against the design. So let's just pinch that piece into position, and we're going to take the right hand end, which is just over on the left for the moment, and wrap that a couple of times around that point. Now it doesn't matter if you go for 2 times or 1.5 times, as long as you do the same on both sides, just make it do what you want it to and make you feel happy with your design. So I'm going to flip this upside down now. There's a bit of wire noise for which I apologise. I'm just going to scooch those beads all the way along and try to get the wires to sit equal and opposite each other. So you can see that this section is in fact fact layering over the preceding pass of wire that goes underneath my focal bead, and that will elevate those beads slightly, and it will also prevent this focal bead from spinning. If you want it to be able to spin, you could sit that slightly further down and add more beads as you desire. So let's pinch that into position and wrap a couple of times around the core, trying to get those wires to sit symmetrically where possible. So let's just pop that down for a second. It's all a little bit like an alien at the moment, with bits coming off in all directions. I've kinked the wire slightly here, so I'm just going to draw that out of the way, bring the project back to the centre of the board for you. I'm actually quite happy with how this is looking. There's a little bit of interesting green in there, but it's quite monochromatic, a tiny touch of gold. I really like this colourway, and I think adding the bronze is another interesting thing that we can do. So what we're going to do is take the wire around in almost the same way as our first layer of that additional wire followed, but this time we're going to just circle it underneath the first pass of wire on that bead, push the tail underneath, and then draw the wire around, again coming up underneath. So I'm just doing one circle of wire between each bead, making sure there's a bit of tension, one circle of wire. Now I've got a really lovely opportunity with a large face bead like this one to do something a bit different. So I'm just going to pause for a second and match on the second side. Because I am going from underneath to over the top every time, you can do a little bit on either side if you want to, rather than flipping it every time you do a bead. However, I would say just concentrate. So what we did is we took the finer wire, our last or layer number 3, so that it goes underneath the initial pass of wire on that bead, all the way around the core one time only. So we're bringing the tail underneath that first pass of wire, and I'll hold that up to the camera at a different angle in a second so you can see how that looks. All the way around the centre one time only. All the way around the centre one time only and up. So we're going to do something on the face of this large bead now. So I'm just going to draw the wire over the surface, and we're just going to doodle on the front of this bead, which will stop it from spinning. So if it is sided, if it's for instance a painted shell bead or something like that, now's the time to choose the side. However, if it was a painted shell bead, you probably wouldn't want to doodle over the surface, but we are going to doodle in wire. So I'm pushing down. I'm just going to circle that wire around, putting a great big thumbprint on it for now, but I'm not overly fussed. So you could have one in one direction, doodle back in the opposite direction, whatever you want to do, whatever you think you can replicate on the far side. If you don't want to do that at all, let's just undo my doodle. If you warm the wire, you should be able to get away with that once, and let's just straighten that out. If you want, what you can do instead of doodling, if you don't think you can replicate, is take that straight over the surface of the bead. Now this will change the orientation of your wrapping. Because we are going from one direction to another, when it comes to where the bead wire goes, we were looking to come from underneath to over the top. So you just need to be aware that you're doing the same thing. The finer gauge wires come from underneath the core, over the surface of the bead. It's really easy to take it underneath instead, but we want that to go over the top if we're going to keep that the same. Wrap that all the way around. Now we won't get a complete rotation here, so I am going to add a cheeky little extra in before going back to that pattern. Finer gauge wire is underneath. It sits underneath the first pass of wire we did, scooches around that central section one time only. And then because I'm using a longer piece of wire this time, I have the opportunity. Do you remember our second section of layering wire fell short? So what I can do is take on the mantle that would have completed, taking the wire now from the top side around that bead to the underneath of that core wire. So you've got options of how you can add extra strength. So I'm just going to do a little bit of speed wrapping now. This is where our first layering wire ran out. So I'm going to double wrap the core here. And then I've got choices about what I want to do here. Now, if you've got not very much wire, but you want to wrap some beads, I tell you what, we'll do this first one by itself. So I've come from the top of the wire this time, like we did on that second pass, to underneath the core. So from the top to underneath, around the upper side of that bead, we're going to wrap around that one time. and 2 times, and then I might bring a cluster of beads in. So let's say we want to do this metallic spacer, a crystal and another metallic spacer. Just pulling that gently into position, you can cluster them together. As long as you're going from over the top of the core wire to underneath or vice versa. We're going to wrap 1.5 times this time, bring another handful of beads in fact let's just do this tiny cube spacer. What I might do at this stage is alternate now which side I want the wrap of wire to go. So from underneath, around the bead, over the top. And then if I go 1.5 times around that core wire, which I didn't quite get tight enough, I might go over the top of the next one. So let's go over the top of this bead, starting over the top of the core, around the top of the bead to underneath. If I go 1.5 times, the next one, which is bead cap, crystal bead, bead cap, I'm going to draw the tail of the wire all the way around the underside of the bead, and then to add some strength, I'm going to wrap 3 times. Or as many times as I feel like, I can't count today. So I'm just going to trim that wire away underneath, making sure I'm trimming the correct part, and neaten that up. All I will need to do now is repeat the exact same process on the other side. Now it pays to go slowly. Whoops, there goes the board. There goes the desk, there goes the beads, there goes the wire. What a surprise. So when you are doing a design like this, the first couple of times, it's really easy to get yourself turned around. So my advice will always be do 1 bead at a time, do 1 bead at a time. And in that way, you won't get too lost. When you get more used to handling the wire and building the layers, you should be okay. Now, there are enough beads and enough wire on this design to create a complete necklace. So if I just pop this down for a second, there's plenty there to make a complete 15.5-inch necklace. You can add some extra space with a bit of chain over the back, just do some wrapped loops, or you can create a J-hook design so that it is a complete collar or collarette, however you prefer to know it. So you've got lots of choices on how you can complete a design like this. If you'd like to join me back up top, I will show you the one that I'm wearing as well. So the piece I'm wearing features some Jessie James beads again. This is Sunset Goddess. It's a very similar technique that I teach for this one. And this only covers the front section. The back part is all chain. Now you can make these till the cows come home. As long as you've got 2 of each bead, you can just cluster those up until they sit equal and opposite. I hope you've enjoyed our tutorial today using Bead Soup, and I look forward to seeing you again very, very soon. Bye for now.